The morning sun softly illuminated the streets, its warm light falling on the lush trees and manicured flower beds. The silence of a Saturday morning, broken only occasionally by the chirping of birds, brought a sense of peace and security. Martha, an elderly woman with a kind look and a quiet smile, stepped habitually out of her home in the neighborhood she had known and loved for years. Her routine walks brought her joy, a chance to feel the breath of a new day, meet familiar neighbors, and say hello to children playing in the street. Martha paced the sidewalk, her slow, measured rhythm of steps in harmony with the nature around her. Her prosthetic limbs, lovingly created by her son, an engineer, helped her maintain her independence. She was proud of her ability to walk despite life's challenges and didn't consider it a feat. It was just her life. Passing by a small park, she stopped for a moment to enjoy the beauty of the blossoming trees. Everything seemed so ordinary, so right. She was confident in the safety of her neighborhood, in the kindness of the people around her. This morning, however, seemed to hide something else behind its idol, something that would disrupt the usual order of her world. Martha continued on her way, not knowing that in just a few minutes her peace would be shattered. The street, which had always had a friendly atmosphere, suddenly seemed too empty. It was just her footsteps, and the light wind playing with the leaves. Martha was already approaching the corner of the street where the small square began. She always liked to stop here to look at the fountain, which gurgled softly, creating a peaceful sound. But today was different. In the distance, she noticed the figure of a man in uniform. The policeman, tall and massive, stood with his arms crossed over his chest as if waiting for someone. When Martha came closer, the man turned his head sharply in her direction. His gaze was hard, as if he already knew what he was going to do. He began to move toward her with quick steps. "Hey, you!" he shouted loudly, attracting the attention of several passers-by who slowed their steps. "Come over here." Martha froze in place, not realizing what was happening. The policeman stopped in front of her, his face tense and cold. "What are you doing here?" he began abruptly. "Why are you loitering in the street?" Martha looked at him perplexed, trying to keep her composure. "Sorry, officer, I'm just on my morning walk," she said softly, trying not to raise her voice. "A morning walk?" His voice sounded sarcastic, almost contemptuous. "Don't you think you're a little too free-spirited for this neighborhood?" "I've lived here for years," she answered calmly, but anxiety began to build inside. "This is my home." The policeman grimaced as if her words irritated him. "Do you have your papers with you?" he asked sharply, not waiting for an answer, already reaching for the walkie-talkie on his shoulder. "I only have my house keys and my cell phone with me." Martha shrugged. She began to feel her confidence leaving her. "Of course," he grinned, looking her over from head to toe. "Where were you headed, Mrs.? Or maybe Miss? Who knows what you're really doing here?" This question was filled with a hidden reproach that could not help but be felt. She suddenly felt that the officer's gaze was not merely suspicious, it was judgmental. "I'm just taking a walk," she repeated, trying to remain calm, but her voice shook a little. "It's just business as usual." The policeman stepped closer, violating her personal space. "A regular thing?" His voice was getting louder. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." Martha looked up, noticing his face contorted with anger. "Do you even realize where you are?" he continued, his voice already rumbling. "People like you can't just wander around decent neighborhoods. You're not here by chance, are you?" "People like me?" Martha questioned, feeling resentment rising in her throat. You know exactly what I mean, he muttered. I'm sure there are complaints about you already. Or would you rather I find out who you really are right now? Despite her inner fear, Martha straightened up. I'm an honest man. I have no reason to hide anything, she said firmly. Of course, of course. He grinned, almost with a sneer. His gaze fell to her legs. What are those? He pointed a finger at her prosthetics. Martha lowered her eyes, feeling a mixture of anger and humiliation rising inside. These are my prosthetics, she said quietly. I wonder, he muttered, are you sure these are yours? Maybe you stole them? This is absurd. Martha couldn't stand it, her voice rising. But the officer ignored her words. He leaned closer to examine them. Take it off, he said calmly but coldly. I beg your pardon? Martha was stunned. Take them off, he repeated, his voice hardening. I want to make sure they're not in the stolen goods database. Martha felt as if the world around her had collapsed. A crowd of bystanders began to gather, but no one dared to intervene. Martha felt a wave of fear come over her. She stood in the middle of the sidewalk, surrounded by curious stares, but not a single passerby made a move to intercede. The policeman looked at her as if she were not a person but a problem to be fixed. I can't take my prosthetics off, officer, she said quietly but confidently. They help me walk. Without them, I can't get around. Please understand. Will I understand? The policeman snorted derisively. Oh, I don't need to understand anything. What, you think you're special? The laws are the same for everyone. If I say, take it off, you take it off. Or, would you prefer I do it myself? The crowd began to whisper. Some took out their cell phones and started filming. Martha felt her face burning with humiliation. She tried to explain herself. These are my prosthetics. They're specially made for me. I have paperwork at home to prove it. Let me just go home and get 'em. Yeah, sure, home. The policeman interrupted her with a sneer. To hide? To make up another lie? Number you think I was born yesterday? You're suspicious and I'm not going to let you just leave. Suspicious? Martha could hardly hold back her tears. Just because I'm black? Those words made him wince, but he recovered quickly, only smiling contemptuously. Oh, of course, he said with a venomous sneer. How convenient. Playing the race card right off the bat. Maybe you should think about how you behave instead of accusing me of racism. How am I behaving? She raised her voice, unable to hide her indignation any longer. I'm just walking around like I always do, like any other person. This is my neighborhood, my street. But he didn't seem to hear her. Instead, he leaned closer, his face grim. Take it off, or I'll call for backup and we'll do it another way, he said threateningly. But it's inhuman, Martha whispered, feeling the tears start to roll down her cheeks. She looked at the people gathered around her, hoping someone would intercede. Somebody help me. This isn't right. Most of those around her, however, only looked away or pretended not to be concerned. The policeman grabbed her shoulder sharply. That's enough, he said stiffly. I'm not going to argue with you. You're being stubborn, and I'm just doing my job. You could have kept it simple. Instead, you decided to make a scene. Please, Martha pleaded, but her voice was already shaking. Don't do this. I'm helpless without them. Helpless? The policeman hummed. Well, we'll see how you do. Maybe this will teach you some respect. And before she could react, he leaned over roughly and began to remove the prosthetic from one of her legs. Martha cried out in pain and humiliation, but he didn't stop. The other prosthesis was also removed just as unceremoniously. She lost her balance and sat down on the sidewalk, completely helpless. The crowd froze. One of the women whispered, "That's terrible." "Shut up," someone else told her sharply. "Do you want him to switch to you?" The policeman held up his prosthetics like trophies. "There," he said, waving them around. "Now, we'll be sure you won't cause any problems. Sit here and wait for me to check them into the database." "You can't leave me like this," Martha screamed, trying to hold on. "I can't even move without them. This is abuse." "It's called the law," he replied gruffly, "and you broke it. I don't know what you're up to, but now you'll be held accountable for your actions." Martha looked at him with utter despair. She felt all the strength leave her body. Her legs, the ones that helped her feel whole, complete, were now in the hands of a man who treated her with contempt. The crowd continued to skim, but no one moved from their seats to help her. Martha sat on the cold sidewalk, feeling defenseless and humiliated. She stared at her prosthetics, which the policeman held carelessly in his hands, as if they were insignificant objects, not part of her being. The crowd around her began to swell. People stopped, casting quick glances at her. Some whispered, others just stared, unable to take their eyes off what was happening. Several young men stood nearby, cell phones in hand. They were silently videotaping everything, their faces a mixture of shock and embarrassment. One of them whispered to another, "This is too much." Did he seriously leave her legless? The one nodded, but took no action. None of them moved any closer. Martha heard one of the women standing nearby say, "Poor woman, but I can't interfere. He has the power." The man next to her threw down. Maybe it's her own fault. Who knows what her story is? Those words hurt Martha. The stranger's words, spoken almost in a whisper, sounded louder than anything she could have imagined. She looked up at the faces of the people gathered around her. Some expressed sympathy, others indifference. Others looked at her with condemnation. The policeman, as if enjoying his power, ostentatiously pretended to check the prostheses, examining them with the look of an expert. His actions attracted more attention, and people continued to gather. One could hear in the crowd, "She's elderly. Why do this to her? Who's going to argue with the police? We don't know anything." Martha tried to maintain her dignity, even while sitting on the ground. She pulled her legs up slowly so as not to draw attention to them. Her heart beat like a drum in her chest, but she remained silent, staring straight ahead, trying not to show how broken she was. The crowd grew larger and larger, but no one made a decisive move. Some looked embarrassed, others frightened. There was a tension in the air, as if the whole world stood still watching the scene. Martha felt tears start to roll down her cheeks, but she quickly wiped them away, not wanting to look weak in front of this indifferent sea of people. She realized that among these people there might have been those who understood what was happening, but their fear of power and their own indecision made them as helpless as she was now. All they had were the phones in their hands, which they used to document this injustice as if it would make a difference. Their silence screamed louder than words. Martha's son, Elijah, was absorbed in his business when the phone broke the silence of his office. It was a call from a neighbor, Mrs. Brown, who, gasping with excitement, told him what was happening. Every word cut his hearing. Your mother, the prosthetics, the police, the crowd. Elijah's heart pounded in a frantic rhythm and his mind filled with a mixture of anger and worry. He didn't hesitate. Grabbing the car keys, he ran outside, feeling the blood pulsing in his temples. Thoughts whirled through his head. What could have happened? Why her? What injustice could justify such cruelty? His mother had always been a symbol of strength and resilience to him, but even the strongest people needed protection. The drive to the square where the events were unfolding seemed endless. Elijah tried his best to stay calm, but every second of waiting only fueled the flames inside him. He knew he had to act coolly, but when he saw the crowd from afar, his rage flared up again. When he got out of the car, he saw a scene that made his blood run cold. His mother, sitting on the sidewalk, looked so small and fragile, as if broken by injustice. Her prosthetic limbs, unceremoniously thrown to the ground next to the policeman, were like a symbol of how cruel the world can be. Elijah stepped into the crowd, his face stony but his eyes stormy. People began to step back in front of him, seeing his determination. Some still had their phones in their hands, but now they stepped back cautiously, realizing that this man had come to make a difference. He approached the policeman, his voice hard and harsh. "It's my mother. I need you to explain what's going on right now." The policeman looked at him with annoyance, but concern flashed in his gaze. Elijah was tall and confident, and his assured presence made the officer hesitate for a moment. "Your mother is acting suspiciously," the policeman began with his usual self-assurance. "She has no papers, and I'm doing my job." "Suspicious?" Elijah narrowed his eyes, his voice ringing with restrained anger. "Suspicious because she's an elderly black woman walking in her neighborhood? Or because you have a preconceived notion about people who don't look like you?" The policeman straightened up, but he didn't look so confident anymore. The crowd around him was quiet, tension hanging in the air like a storm cloud. "Look," the officer began, but Elijah interrupted him. "No, you listen to me. You humiliated my mother. You left her sitting here, helpless, because you think you have the right. You overstepped your authority." Elijah bent down, picked up the prosthetics from the ground, and handed them to his mother. His movements were quick but careful. He helped her stand up, holding her hand. Martha's gaze was filled with gratitude and pain. The crowd began to change. Someone in the crowd timidly supported Elijah. "He's right. It wasn't fair." These words, though quiet, were the impetus for the others. Suddenly, there was whispering, and someone spoke louder. "Why didn't anyone stop this sooner?" The policeman, noticing the situation getting out of hand, began to make excuses. "I was acting within the law. You don't understand the big picture." But Elijah wasn't listening anymore. His voice came out loud, addressing everyone. "This picture is clear to each of us. It is a picture of injustice that is tolerated by many, but I will not allow it to continue. Not with my mother, not with anyone else." Elijah stood holding his mother's hand, his gaze fixed on the policeman. The crowd around him was no longer silent. People were whispering. Some were taking video, and some were trying to figure out what was going to happen next. Tension hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. "Bias," Elijah began, his voice flat but powerful. "It's not just a word. It's what just happened in front of everyone here." The policeman lifted his chin, clearly trying not to show that his words hurt. "I was acting within the law," he retorted, but his voice trembled. Elijah nodded as if in agreement, but continued in a cuttingly calm tone. "Within the law? The law requires you to humiliate an elderly woman by leaving her unable to get around? The law justifies your suspicions just because she's black? Tell me, officer, what exactly did she do to make you consider her a threat?" The policeman was silent, his gaze wandering. He looked around at the crowd as if seeking support, but met with silent condemnation. She couldn't produce identification. It's standard procedure, he began, but Elijah held up a hand to stop him. Standard procedure? Have you seen any of the other passers-by you didn't even stop being subjected to the same treatment? Or is this standard procedure only applied to people you think don't fit in? The policeman opened his mouth to say something, but Elijah had already stepped forward, his gaze turning icy. "Let me introduce myself," he said, his voice louder, drawing even more attention from the crowd. "My name is Elijah Robinson. I'm an attorney and founder of a civil rights organization. It's my job to handle cases like this, and believe me, this case will be publicized." Those words made the policeman stagger. He looked at Elijah with a new fear, realizing that the situation was no longer under his control. "I was just doing my job," he mumbled, but it already sounded like a pathetic excuse. "Doing your job?" Elijah leaned closer again, keeping his voice low, but his words cut like a knife. "You overstepped your authority. You used your power to humiliate a defenseless woman whose only crime was the color of her skin. That's not work. It's an abuse of power." The crowd began to agree. Someone shouted loudly, "He's right. It was pure injustice." The policeman began to retreat, his confidence gone. He tried to mumble something into the radio, but it was clear that he had lost control of the situation. "I'm not going to let this go," Elijah continued. "You will be an example that bias and injustice have no place in our society. I'm going to hold you accountable for your actions, and I won't stop until you feel the same helplessness that my mother felt." The policeman took a step back and then turned sharply, walking away toward his car as if hoping to escape the judgmental stares. The crowd erupted in discussion, but Elijah paid no attention to them. He turned to his mother again, his face softening. "It's okay, Mom. It's going to be okay now," he said, hugging her. But inside he knew. The fight was just beginning. Elijah stared after the policeman, who slumped his shoulders and walked away to his car. The anger inside him was boiling, but he knew that rage and accusations wouldn't fix what had happened. He took a deep breath, turning back to the crowd that had frozen in anticipation. Their faces were different. Some looked on with judgment, some with respect, and some with guilt for doing nothing. He lowered his eyes to his mother standing beside him, still trembling from the humiliation she'd suffered. Her face, tired though it was, radiated the strength and dignity that Elijah had always admired in her. He squeezed her hand as if to convey confidence. "I know," he began, addressing the audience, "that many of you are uncomfortable right now. Some of you are taking pictures on your phones. Some of you are just watching. Some may be thinking, 'It's none of my business.' I don't blame you for that." His voice was even and firm, but there was no anger in it, only sincerity and warmth that made several people lower their eyes. In life, we often encounter situations we don't expect. We may feel fear, confusion, or simply not know the right thing to do. But today, I want us all to reflect on what makes us human. It's not power. It's our kindness and our respect for one another. He turned to the policeman who was standing by the car, pretending to check something but clearly listening to every word. "Officer," Elijah addressed him, his voice softer, "I realize that you may have acted out of fear or the stereotypes that have become part of our system. I don't want to ruin your life. I want you to understand what it's like to be in my mother's shoes. how it feels to be humiliated just because you don't meet someone else's expectations. The policeman turned around, his face tense, but he didn't interrupt. Elijah continued, "Respect is not a weakness. It is a strength that unites us. When we look at a person not through the lens of prejudice, but through the lens of humanity, we become better people. You could have shown that respect today, but you chose a different path. I hope you will make a different choice next time." The crowd quieted down. People began to nod, their gazes softening. Some of the young men put down their phones, stopping to take pictures, as if realizing that it was important not just to be a spectator, but to reflect on their actions. Elijah turned to his mother, his voice quiet again, almost a whisper, addressed only to her. "You're strong, Mom. You've always been strong. But today, your strength is an example to all of us. I'm proud of you." Martha smiled through her tears, and the crowd began to slowly disperse. But Elijah knew that the seeds sown that day had already begun to sprout. With kindness and compassion, he had given the crowd not just a spectacle, but a lesson that would probably change their hearts. The policeman stood by his car, as if sheltering behind the metal casing from the stares of the crowd. His hands were nervously rubbing his radio, but he hadn't made any calls. Elijah's words echoed in his head like an echo that couldn't be drowned out. He tried to convince himself that he'd done the right thing, that he'd followed procedure, but the truth was already gnawing at his mind. Every moment of that morning came back to him in his thoughts. The elderly woman's voice shaking with fear, her tears sitting helplessly on the cold sidewalk. She had done nothing wrong. Deep down, he'd known that all along. But the stereotypes that had been ingrained in him during his years of service made him act automatically, without thinking of the consequences. He raised his eyes and looked at Martha, who was now sitting on the bench, leaning on her son. Her face was no longer fearful, but there was still pain in it. The policeman felt the pain echoing in his heart. Suddenly, he felt unbearably ashamed of himself. He remembered his first days on duty, when he joined the police force with a sincere desire to protect and help people. Back then, he had vowed to be honest, fair, to serve the community, not destroy it. Somewhere along the way, he lost that goal. The job became routine, and routine brutality became part of his life. He closed the door of the patrol car and walked slowly toward Martha and Elijah. The crowd had not yet dispersed completely, and people were wary of his movements. When he stopped in front of them, his voice was quieter than ever. "I'm sorry," he said, looking at Martha. His words were tentative but sincere. "Yeah, I made a mistake. I was unfair. I have no excuses." Martha looked up at him, her eyes full of surprise and doubt. She wasn't used to hearing such words from someone in a position of power. "I'm sorry I put you through this," he continued, his voice shaking a little. "What I did was wrong. I let my prejudices and emotions get the best of me. That's no excuse, but I want to change." Elijah, who was sitting next to his mother, stared at the policeman. He wanted to see if what he was saying was real. There was no confidence or aggression in the man's voice, only genuine remorse. "Your remorse is important," Elijah said, his voice calm but firm. "But it should be the beginning, not the end. If you really want to change, start by admitting your mistakes to yourself and using your power to protect, not destroy." The policeman nodded, his eyes downcast. He felt the weight of his actions for the first time in a long time. "I'll do anything to make it up to you," he said quietly, looking at Martha. "If I may, I'd like to apologize to you again and maybe help you get home." Martha looked at him long and carefully. She could see that this man was struggling with himself, trying to realize and correct his mistakes, and though the pain of humiliation still lived in her heart, she knew that forgiveness was something that could change not only him, but the world around him. "I accept your apology," she said, her voice soft but determined. "But remember, officer, respect and justice start with small actions. Make sure no one else has to go through what I went through." The policeman nodded, his face serious. He realized that this moment would be a turning point for him. You can't change the past, but you can change the future. And today, he had taken the first step towards it. The policeman took a deep breath, realizing that dozens of eyes were looking at him at that moment. The crowd, which had already begun to disperse, froze when they heard his footsteps. He turned to the crowd, feeling the weight of his own guilt and the words that were about to fall from his lips. "I was wrong," he began loudly, his voice echoing off the nearby buildings. "What I did today was unjust and unreasonable. My actions were not dictated by the law, but by prejudice. I humiliated a woman who had done nothing wrong." He took a breath, his gaze darting between the faces of the crowd until he found Martha's gaze. "Mrs. Robinson, I have hurt you and robbed you of your dignity. I have no excuse. I sincerely apologize for my actions. I promise it won't happen again," he said, his voice trembling. But he continued, "And not just to me, but to other officers as well. I will try to make changes wherever possible." Martha stared at him silently. The crowd murmured. Some nodded with approval, some remained incredulous. But the moment seemed to matter to everyone. It was an act of confession, rare and important. News of the incident spread quickly. Videos shot by passers-by appeared on social networks, garnering thousands of views in a matter of hours. People argued in the comments, discussing what exactly happened. Some condemned the actions of the police officer, others tried to justify his behavior. But one thing was clear. This event was a catalyst for a deeper conversation about the injustice and bias that exists in society. The next day, local newspapers published articles about the incident. The headlines screamed injustice, and the pictures of Marta and Elijah in front of the patrol car became a symbol of the struggle for human rights. In interviews, Martha spoke with restraint but firmly, emphasizing the importance of respect and equality. She did not want revenge, but wanted no one else to go through what she had gone through. Elijah, for his part, used this moment to initiate real change. He brought together activists and lawyers and invited police representatives to open discussions about bias and the need for reform. This was not just a reaction to an incident, but the beginning of a long-term process to change the system. One of the first steps Elijah proposed was mandatory cultural competency and emotional intelligence training for police officers. In response to his initiative, some officers showed support, including the very police officer who humiliated Martha. He spoke at one of the meetings, admitting his mistakes and talking about how the incident made him rethink his behavior. "We, as officers, should be an example to society, not a cause of fear and injustice," he said, his voice firm but sincere. "I made a mistake, and it is my duty to correct not only myself, but the system I am a part of." His words elicited mixed reactions. Some could not forgive his actions, others saw it as a step toward awareness and change. But one thing was clear. This incident was the beginning of a conversation that could no longer be ignored. In the weeks that followed, local authorities began considering proposals to introduce new protocols for engaging with citizens. Elijah and his team pushed for training to include real-life examples that showed the consequences of bias. They insisted that people who had suffered injustice share their stories with future generations of police officers. Meanwhile, society began to change. People who witnessed that day could no longer remain indifferent. Young activists started organizing events dedicated to unity and equality. Hashtags supporting Martha and emphasizing the need for reform appeared on social media. Martha, however, became a symbol of resilience despite her pain. She spoke at meetings, sharing her experiences and calling for kindness and justice. She spoke about the importance of not responding to hate with hate, but also of not letting injustice go unpunished. "We can't change the past," she said at an event, "but we can build a future where no one is afraid to leave their home for fear of being humiliated for who they are." This incident was the beginning of a long journey, a journey on which every step mattered, every voice mattered, and every small victory brought us closer to a big change. Elijah sat in the small living room with his mother, immersed in thought. In a few minutes, the man they'd encountered that memorable day would be here. The policeman himself had requested this meeting, an informal one, without cameras or prying eyes. He said he wanted to apologize and explain why that day had changed him. Martha held the cup of tea in her hands, her face calm, but her eyes deep in concentration. Elijah tried to convince her to back out of the meeting, but she was adamant. "We can't talk about change unless we are willing to lead by example," she said. "Forgiveness is not a weakness. It is a strength that can turn pain into healing." When the doorbell rang, the tension in the room was almost palpable. Elijah opened it, and the officer stood on the doorstep. But now there wasn't an ounce of the arrogance he'd displayed before. His shoulders were slightly slumped, and his gaze sought to meet Martha's. "Thank you for seeing me," he began, timidly entering the room. Martha gestured for him to sit down. Elijah watched, keeping his emotions under control, but inwardly ready to intervene if the conversation went wrong. The policeman sighed, gathering his thoughts, and spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about that day, about what I did, and the more I reflect, the more I realize how deeply wrong I was. I acted not as a defender of the law, but as a man driven by prejudice. I made you suffer, and I can't shake it." Martha looked at him without interrupting. He continued, "After this incident, I began to participate in the training program initiated by your son. I listened to the stories of people who faced injustice and realized how often I myself had become part of the problem. It changed me. But I know that words are not enough. I am here to ask for your forgiveness and to prove that I am capable of changing." There was silence in the room. The policeman sat with his head down, clearly not expecting to hear the answer easily. Martha finally spoke, her voice soft but firm. "Forgiveness isn't a gift for you," she said. "It's my way of taking away the power the past has over me. I forgive you not because you deserve it, but because I choose peace over resentment." Her words made the policeman look up. He was clearly shocked, not by the woman's insolence but by her generosity. Elijah, who had been silent until then, added, "Forgiveness does not remove responsibility, but it does give you a chance to change. We want to believe that you can use this experience to be a better person, for yourself and for others." The policeman nodded, struggling to hide his tears. He realized that he had received not just forgiveness, but an opportunity to atone for his mistakes with action. When he left, Martha turned to her son. "We gave him a chance," she said. "Now it's up to him to take it." Elijah nodded. This moment was not just the end of a story, but the beginning of a new chapter. The Robinson family had shown that even in the darkest moment, light could be found. And that light not only heals wounds, but helps others find a path to peace and change. What do you think about this story? Have you had any incidents of injustice or racism in your life? We would be happy if you could share your thoughts and experiences in the comments. Your stories are very important to us. Each of them helps us to better understand each other and build a more just society. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and put a like if this story touched you or made you think. It really keeps us going and inspires us to share more stories. Wishing you a wonderful day filled with kindness and warmth.